Adolf Tolkachev handed the CIA military secrets worth billions of dollars. He destroyed the Soviet Air Force from the inside. But when it came time to name his price, he did not ask for diamonds. He did not ask for a suitcase full of cash. He asked for a Beatles album and a box of American antibiotics. Adolf became the billion-dollar spy for one reason: to keep his dying son alive. But the most shocking part of this story is not his execution. It's that the son he died to save grew up to spit on his grave. Moscow, winter, midnight. Adolf sat in his car. He did not use the wipers. He wanted the snow to hide him. In his pocket, he did not have a gun. He had a note from a school notebook. Inside the cabin, the air was stale, smelling faintly of unburnt gasoline and old, damp wool, but Adolf could only smell the metallic tang of his own fear. His hands gripped the steering wheel with such ferocity that his knuckles had turned the color of old parchment, and he felt a phantom vibration running through his arms, a tremor that had nothing to do with the idling engine. In the deep pocket of his heavy, nondescript coat lay neither a microdot camera nor a silenced pistol, but a folded piece of paper torn from a child's school notebook, the edges frayed from his nervous fingers tracing the perimeter again and again. Earlier that day, under the fluorescent hum of the laboratory lights, he had committed treason with the casual efficiency of a clerk stamping an invoice. He had photographed the schematics for the latest airborne radar interception system, a technology that the Politburo believed would secure air superiority for the next decade. The intelligence was worth billions in research and development costs to the adversary, a strategic leap that could alter the balance of the Cold War. Yet Adolf did not think of global politics or the ethics of betrayal. His mind was anchored to a small, dimly lit room in a communal apartment where his son lay fighting a bronchial infection that the local clinic treated with indifference and expired aspirin. The West saw him as a master spy, a mole burrowed deep within the heart of the Soviet military-industrial complex. But he saw himself merely as a desperate father trading state secrets for the only currency that mattered. He was not selling his country for diamonds or political asylum. He was bartering it for 4 packages of erythromycin and 3 vinyl records by the Beatles. The waiting was always the worst part. A purgatory where every shadow looked like a KGB agent, and every passing car sounded like a black Volga coming to take him to Lefortovo. He checked his watch, the dial glowing faintly green in the gloom, and noted that it was 3 minutes past midnight. Suddenly, in the rearview mirror, a pair of headlights cut through the swirling snow, growing rapidly larger until they filled the cabin with a blinding white light that forced him to squint. The world outside contracted to the narrow slit of his driver's side window, which he had cracked open exactly 2 inches, just as the protocol demanded. A large black sedan glided past him, slowing down for a fraction of a second that felt like an eternity. From the darkness of the passing vehicle, a hand encased in a fine leather glove emerged, indistinguishable from the night itself, and tossed a heavy, tape-wrapped bundle through the gap in his window before the car accelerated away, vanishing into the snowstorm as if it had never existed. Adolf did not look at the bundle immediately, though he could feel its weight pressing into the passenger seat like a physical accusation. He knew exactly what it contained, and the knowledge made him light-headed with a mixture of terror and euphoria. Inside that package was the promise of health for his son and the forbidden sounds of a world where joy was not rationed by the state. He put the car in gear, his movements mechanical, and pulled away from the curb, his eyes darting to the rear-view mirror every few seconds to ensure he was not being followed. The exchange had taken less than 10 seconds, yet it had irrevocably altered the trajectory of his life once again. As he navigated the treacherous, icy streets of Moscow, he realized he was no longer just an engineer or a citizen. He was a conduit between two warring worlds, a man who had just sold the sky to save a single, fragile life on Earth. The concrete walls of the Scientific Research Institute for Radio Engineering were painted a shade of green that seemed designed to drain the spirit from anyone who walked the endless corridors. For Adolf, entering the facility each morning was like stepping into a sealed tomb where the air was recycled and the silence was heavy with unsaid threats. He sat at his drafting table, surrounded by the hum of cooling fans and the scratch of graphite on vellum, designing the eyes and ears of the Soviet war machine. Under his hands lay the intricate topography of radar arrays capable of tracking targets through the densest cloud cover, technological marvels that were the envy of the world, yet he felt nothing but a cold, simmering loathing for the genius required to build them. The contrast between the lethality of the weapons he engineered and the fragility of his own existence was a jagged pill he swallowed daily. While he calculated the precise angles for signal reflection to ensure the destruction of phantom enemies, his real battle began only when he punched out his time card and returned to the suffocating reality of his home. The apartment was a communal hive of misery, a cramping series of rooms shared by 5 families, where privacy was a myth and the air always carried the sour, cloying stench of boiled cabbage and wet laundry. But the true horror for Adolf was not the squalor, but the sound that greeted him every evening, the wet, rattling cough of his son echoing from behind the thin plywood door of their room. The boy was fading, his skin translucent and pale against the gray sheets, his breath coming in shallow, painful gasps that seemed to count down the minutes of his life. Soviet medicine, heralded in the newspapers as the finest in the world, had offered them nothing but bureaucratic indifference. The doctors at the district clinic had shrugged their shoulders, prescribing useless mustard plasters and preaching the virtue of patience, as if waiting were a cure for a lung infection that was slowly drowning the child. Adolf watched the light dim in his son's eyes and felt a primal rage eclipse his fear, a realization that the state which demanded his loyalty was indifferent to his tragedy. In the evenings, when the coughing subsided enough to allow a moment of peace, they would huddle together by the window, turning the dial of a modified shortwave radio. Through the static and the aggressive jamming signals of the government, they hunted for the faint, rhythmic pulse of the voice of America. When the opening chords of a rock and roll song broke through the electronic haze, the room transformed. The music was a lifeline, a vibrant transmission from a world where color and life existed in abundance, and for a few precious minutes, the boy would smile, fueled by his father's whispered tales of skyscrapers, denim, and supermarkets. It was in these moments of shared conspiracy that the engineer died and the spy was born. Adolf looked at the trembling hands of his son and realized that the ideology of the party meant nothing against the survival of his bloodline. He understood with a terrifying clarity that the blueprints locked in the Institute's safe were not just state secrets, they were a currency of unimaginable value. The Americans did not need to offer him ideology or freedom. They simply needed to offer the antibiotics that the Soviet pharmacies lacked. He would trade the strategic security of the motherland for a bottle of pills, and he would do it without a flicker of remorse. For the exchange rate was set not by geopolitics, but by the desperate love of a father refusing to bury his child. Adolf ceased to be a mere man composed of flesh and bone. He had calcified into a mechanism driven by a volatile fuel mixture of pure adrenaline and terror. The mundane rhythm of the Institute, with its tea breaks and political lectures, became nothing more than a cover for his true, clandestine profession. During the day, he moved through the corridors like a ghost, an unassuming engineer with a receding hairline and a weary gait, but his senses were tuned to a frequency that his colleagues could not perceive. He would sign out top-secret files from the secure library, carrying the heavy binders to the privacy of a bathroom stall or a quiet corner of his office during the lunch hour. There, with hands that he forced to be steady through sheer will, he would retrieve the device that had become his constant companion, a miniature sub-miniature camera, an engineering marvel concealed within a nondescript key fob. He would hover over the blueprints of phased array radars and guidance systems capable of look-down, shoot-down targeting, capturing the proprietary secrets of the Soviet Union, one frame at a time. The click of the shutter was a deafening roar in his own ears, a sound he was certain would summon the guards, yet it was the only sound that made him feel truly alive. These documents were the lifeblood of the nation's defense, representing billions of rubles in investment and the collective genius of thousands of scientists. By transferring them to the West, Adolf was effectively saving the American military budget decades of research and development, handing them the keys to Soviet airspace on a silver platter. Yet, the magnitude of his theft meant nothing to him in terms of monetary gain. He was a traitor who had no use for gold bullion or numbered accounts in Swiss banks. His ledger was balanced in a currency that the Kremlin despised and the black market coveted: the vibrant psychedelic covers of rock albums and the sterile, foil-backed blisters of Western pharmaceuticals. He traded the technical specifications of the Me-G avionics for the heavy blues of Led Zeppelin, the driving hard rock of Deep Purple, and the ethereal soundscapes of Pink Floyd. These records were more than just vinyl. They were artifacts from a planet where freedom had a rhythm, tangible proof that a reality existed outside the gray concrete of Moscow. Alongside the music came the medicine, packages covered in foreign script that he could barely decipher, containing chemical compounds that were essentially miracles compared to the chalky pills available at the local pharmacy. Each successful handoff, each roll of film passed through a car window, translated directly into the vitality of his son. The boy, who had once been confined to his bed, pale and gasping, was now sitting up, listening to the intricate guitar solos of Jimmy Page, his cheeks flushed not with fever, but with the return of health. Adolf viewed every click of his camera shutter as a bullet fired into the spine of the system that had tried to let his child die. He was dismantling the superpower that employed him, dismantling it not out of political conviction, but with the fierce, focused hatred of a parent who had been pushed too far. With every stolen secret, the Leviathan weakened, and his son grew stronger, a trade-off that Adolf would have made 1,000 times over, regardless of the consequences waiting for him in the shadows. Adolf was betraying his nation, risking execution every single day. But ask yourself, if your child was dying and the government would not help, how far would you go? Would you become a traitor to save your son? Let me know in the comments. 3 years of living in the crosshairs had eroded Adolf's nervous system until paranoia was no longer a mood, but a physical weight he carried on his shoulders, heavy and suffocating like a leaden coat. The city of Moscow, once merely gray and indifferent, had transformed into a landscape of potential threats where every shadow held a pair of watching eyes. Walking down the street became an exercise in terror. He was convinced that the pedestrians passing him were slowing their pace, their gazes lingering on his back a fraction of a second too long, memorizing his gait and his routine. The sanctuary of his apartment had been breached by his own mind. The telephone, once a lifeline to the outside world, had become an instrument of torture. He would stare at the black Bakelite receiver, certain that the dial tone carried a suspicious, hollow echo, and that the faint clicks interrupting his conversations were not faults in the aging Soviet infrastructure, but the clumsy sounds of a recording device clicking into place at the Lubyanka. He knew with a chilling certainty that the invisible noose was tightening around his neck when the cars began to appear. They were always the same make and model, drab gray Volgas with tinted windows and antennas that reached a little too high towards the sky, idling near the entrance of his building at odd hours of the night. Their engines purred with a low, menacing rumble, and although he never saw the faces of the men inside, he could feel their attention fixed on his window, dissecting his life from behind a layer of glass and steel. Logic dictated that he should sever the connection, burn the cameras, flush the remaining films down the toilet, and retreat into the safety of mediocrity. But stopping was no longer an option, for the trap he had built was not made of steel bars, but of love and dependency. His son, the boy who had once been a fragile ghost hovering on the brink of death, had blossomed into a terrifying picture of health and demand. The antibiotics had done their work too well, and the music had sparked a hunger that could not be sated by mere survival. Adolf had pulled it off. The medicine worked. And if you want to see more stories of history's most desperate spies, make sure to hit that subscribe button. The child no longer gasped for air. He clamored for status symbols from a world he had never seen. He demanded authentic American blue jeans that cost a month's salary on the black market, packets of colorful chewing gum that tasted of synthetic fruit, and the latest records that were banned by the Ministry of Culture. Adolf realized with a sinking heart that he had become a hostage to his own success, a dealer who had addicted his own family to the intoxicating needle of Western prosperity. He looked at his son, who was now bold and rosy-cheeked, and saw not just a survivor, but a consumer whose appetite was fed by high treason. To silence the screaming alarm bells in his head, Adolf constructed a fortress of rationalization. He told himself that he was not a killer, that his hands were stained with ink, not blood. What he passed through the window of the car were merely sheets of paper, theoretical lines and mathematical equations that existed in the abstract realm of engineering. He convinced himself that these diagrams of radars and guidance systems were harmless, intellectual exercises that would never actually be forged into steel to kill real people. It was a desperate lie, a flimsy shield against the reality that he was dismantling the defenses of his nation to buy denim and vinyl. But it was the only truth he had left to hold on to as the gray Volgas waited patiently in the snow. The end did not arrive amidst the screech of tires on wet asphalt or the chaotic gunfire of a Hollywood chase, but rather in the deceptive tranquility of a Sunday afternoon at the dacha. Adolf stood by the rusty iron grill, turning skewers of marinating pork over the dying embers, the smoke stinging his eyes in a way that felt strangely comforting, a domestic ritual that belonged to a normal life he pretended to possess. It was his son's 16th birthday, a milestone that seemed miraculous given the frailty of the boy's childhood, and the air was filled with the scent of pine needles and the buzzing of early summer insects. The capture was a masterpiece of silence and terrifying efficiency, executed by men who moved through the tall grass like vipers. One moment Adolf was checking the meat for doneness, and in the next fraction of a second, the sky vanished, replaced by the heavy, crushing weight of bodies slamming him into the earth. The operation was so swift and surgical that the neighbors, bent over their beds of cucumbers and strawberries just a few yards away, did not even straighten their backs to investigate the commotion. Adolf's face was pressed hard into the damp clover and dirt, grit filling his mouth, his arm twisted behind his back with a force that threatened to snap the bone. He did not struggle, for the inevitability of this moment had been stalking him for years, waiting for him to lower his guard. As the rough fabric of a canvas bag was drawn down over his head, extinguishing the sunlight, his peripheral vision caught one final, searing image that would burn in his mind forever. His son stood on the porch, frozen in a tableau of confusion and horror, his eyes wide and vacant. The boy was clutching his chest, not in pain, but to protect the gleaming silver box of a brand-new Japanese cassette player, the final gift, the last transaction of a father who had sold his soul to put music in his child's ears. Then the darkness was total, and the smell of the barbecue was replaced by the stench of sweat and terror in the back of a van speeding towards the city center. Lefortovo prison was a universe stripped of color and sound, a stark contrast to the vibrant world of Western album covers Adolf had inhabited in his mind. There was no Led Zeppelin here to drown out the silence, no imported antibiotics to cure the damp chill that settled into his bones, only the echo of steel doors slamming and the rhythmic tread of guards in the corridor. The interrogation room was a windowless box where time lost all meaning, and the men across the metal table did not care about a sick child or a father's love. They cared only for names, dates, and technical specifications. Day after day, they dismantled his life with the same precision he had used to photograph radar schematics, peeling back his justifications until nothing remained but the naked fact of his treason. He realized with a cold, hollow dread that the exchange rate of his existence had crashed. He was no longer the billion-dollar spy, but a liability to be liquidated, his value reduced to zero. The judicial process was a hollow ritual, a piece of theater performed for an audience of none. The trial was closed, secret, and brief, conducted in a room that smelled of dust and floor wax. There were no impassioned speeches or legal maneuvers, only the dry, monotonous reading of the criminal code by a judge who barely looked up from his papers. The verdict was a foregone conclusion, written in the stiff, unyielding language of Soviet bureaucracy that tolerated no objections. When the sentence was pronounced, the exceptional measure of punishment, execution by firing squad, Adolf felt a strange detachment, as if the words applied to a stranger. He stood in the wooden dock, listening to the decree that ended his life, while his mind drifted back to the static-filled chords of a guitar and the image of a boy holding a silver box, safe and alive, bought and paid for with the blood of the man standing before the tribunal. 30 years had dissolved into history, burying the Soviet gray under layers of glass, steel, and neon, transforming the city into a sprawling monument to capitalism. In a spacious, sterile office on the 42nd floor of a gleaming business center in the heart of modern Moscow, the air smelled not of boiled cabbage and fear, but of expensive leather and climate-controlled oxygen. The man sitting behind the massive mahogany desk was 46 years old, his face smooth, tanned, and well-fed, possessing the confident, predatory gaze of someone who had successfully navigated the turbulent waters of the new era. He was busy signing a stack of lucrative government contracts for the supply of domestic surveillance equipment, his gold fountain pen gliding across the paper with the authority of a man who knows he is on the winning side. Above him, a framed portrait of the president looked down with a stern, approving eye, while a silver-framed photograph of a smiling wife and two healthy children stood on the desk, shielding him from the ghosts of a communal past. A young journalist, invited to profile this titan of industry on the subject of patriotic education for the youth, let his recording device run and allowed his eyes to wander to the corner of the room. There, incongruous amidst the minimalist Italian furniture and abstract art, sat a battered cardboard box filled with old vinyl records. "I see you are a connoisseur of the classics," the reporter noted, gesturing towards the collection with a polite smile. "Do you indulge in a bit of retro music to relax?" The businessman's expression curdled instantly, a mask of visceral distaste slipping over his polished features. He stood up, walked over to the box, and reached inside, pulling out a sleeve that would have made a collector's heart stop. An original English first pressing of Abbey Road, the cover vibrant and pristine. He held the album not with reverence, but with the disdain one might hold a dead rodent found in a kitchen. "This?" he sneered, his voice dripping with a performative patriotism that seemed to vibrate off the walls. "I keep this here as a reminder of what not to be." With a sudden, violent motion, he brought the vinyl down against his knee. The record snapped with a sharp, sickening crack that echoed through the silent office like a gunshot, shattering the faces of the four musicians crossing the street. He tossed the jagged black shards into a metal wastebasket, dusting his hands as if they had been contaminated by a disease. "I hate this Western garbage," he declared, his voice rising with conviction. "It is poison. This is the trash that rotted the foundation of a great empire, distracted us with shiny wrappers and degenerate rhythms, while they stole our sovereignty." He looked the journalist in the eye, his gaze hard and unforgiving, seeking validation for his righteous anger. "My father was a weak man," he continued, his tone cold and detached. "A traitor who sold his country for rags and plastic discs. He was shot, and he deserved it." He cared more about jeans and this noise than he did about the motherland or his duty. The businessman adjusted his silk tie, the knot perfectly centered, and sat back down to finish signing the state contracts. He spoke of loyalty, strength, and national pride, entirely oblivious to the terrible irony that coursed through his veins. He had forgotten, or perhaps chosen to erase, the truth that the very lungs filling with air to denounce his father were only functioning because of that garbage. He did not remember that the strong heart beating in his chest was purchased with those shattered records, and that he was sitting in this chair, alive and prosperous, only because a trembling man in a dark car had once loved him enough to die for him.